I've come out just north of Rock Springs, Wyoming to tell the story of a race massacre which happened here on September 2nd, 1885, and also to explain that it was more coordinated by the Knights of Labor and by the Union Pacific Railroad. Understand that the mines opened up along the areas which were owned by the Union Pacific Railroad because they held a monopoly on transportation through the state of Wyoming. At the time, it was a territory, and it was very beneficial to the Union Pacific Railroad to hire Chinese laborers because they would always take the lowest possible wages. They weren't really concerned with organizing because they believed if they formed a union, then the whites would come down on them, and they were also just very different looking. So they knew that the white miners, the Italians and the Slovenes, specifically there were a lot of Slovenes here, would be against them because they looked so much different. And it was an easy target, and the Union Pacific Railroad knew this. So in early September or late August, a number of white miners approached mine pit number 6, where about 6 Chinese miners were active and looking for gold. And they came up and they said, "You have no right to mine in an area this productive." So the Chinese said, "Well, the Union Pacific Railroad hired us to stay here. We're not moving." Well, the white miners decided to start beating them, and 2 were beaten so severely, 1 actually died, and the 2 were the ones who refused to leave, because most of them just left, because these white miners came in with guns. And as soon as 1 was killed, they started amassing in town. And by September 2nd, the lynch mob had been formed, and although there's no evidence to suggest that the Knights of Labor was involved, miners prior to this had gathered inside of the Knights of Labor's kind of headquarters. And this is a proto-union that wanted to unionize miners all of a specific race before they began unionizing as a whole, like the Wobblies or the United Mine Workers would organize as a whole. And so they viewed the Chinese as well as terrorists or as, targets, rather than as people that they need to unite with against the Union Pacific for their exploitative practices. And so they rang the bell, and a lot of miners flooded out into the streets with their Lee Enfield rifles, and they began marching towards Chinatown, which I believe was on the north end of town, now underneath an elementary school. And a lot of them said, "We don't want any violence, so we're going to go into saloons and general stores, and we're just going to wait it out." But the Union Pacific Railroad, and this is why I say they are culpable for this massacre, they convinced all of the saloons and general stores to close, using very heavy-handed tactics, very thuggish. And so all these miners had nothing to do but go down to Chinatown. And by about 11 a.m., they had split off into separate battalions and groups of squads. And these squads were taking up, like holing up, in the storage containers and sheds and in different areas around the Chinese camp before the Chinese even realized it. And then they sent a small group into Chinatown proper to warn them they had an hour to leave. However, within 3 minutes, shots rang out from the storage shed, and they began rushing into the town, pouring through the streets on a very systematic basis and killing Chinese people. It's said when the Chinese survivors went to the consulate in New York that they basically would beat you and try to take your valuables, but if you tried running at all, they would just kill you. And sometimes they would also kill you for no reason after you had surrendered, and some of them didn't even use bullets, they only beat them with the butts of their guns. By about 3 p.m., it had been rapidly realized that they had immediately targeted all of the leaders of the Chinese miners. So a number of respected elders had been killed. And as soon as this rumor had gotten out, because they'd heard before, white men forming mobs and shooting guns into the air, they didn't think anything of it until they heard, "Oh, a lot of us have been killed." And so immediately, the crowd that was gathered on the bridge, mostly women, some of the women were actually shooting down into Chinatown as well and taking shots. They saw the Chinese miners just immediately pour out of their houses, and there was no organization. They ran up into the hills, they ran anywhere they could, but they couldn't escape. A lot of them tried wading across the nearby Bitter Creek, but were shot along the banks, and some of them presumably by women. One of them made his way out of his house and ended up lynched to death in the white-only clothing laundry area in town, like a washroom, and it's said that 15 miners died, but a more accurate estimate is 14 to 50, and many of those who fled into the hills were never seen again. And in the aftermath of this, the army actually had to come in and occupy the town. And the town was adamant in saying, "This is good. Isn't America proud of us?" But every other newspaper pretty much in the country decried it, even extremist ones. They were saying this is an example of feral hatred and violence. It makes us look like just a terrifying, barbaric country. How could we do this? And so the town doubled down on its anger. They nailed the testicles of one of the miners to the wall of a saloon, displaying it as a trophy of the hunt. And when the government finally came down on these guys, they found that a couple of the people were actually members of the territorial legislature. And they indicted, I believe, 16 people, but the official ruling of the court was, we are unable to find that they did anything illegal or that any white person at all on that date did anything illegal. And a couple years later, they would finally pass the Chinese exclusion laws, which made sure that no Chinese migrant worker could come into America for the next 10 years. This was a period of rising anti-Chinese sentiment, and similar race riots happened in kind of shockwaves after this in places like Puget Sound and Washington, where a lot of them were serving as laborers. What you'll notice about cemeteries in mining towns is that they always have graves of people from every part of the world, all traveling to this remote place out west, looking for work to send the money back home to their families. Many of the graves in the back of the local cemetery come from as far away as Finland, Yugoslavia, Wales, and Slovenia. Actually, a little bit earlier in the video, I showed the Slovenian Miners' Hall, which still exists in town. These were the most common ethnicities of laborers who would come here for work to send the money back home to their families. A photo in the Rock Springs Museum shows what the original monument to the massacre was intended to look like. Unfortunately, the actual monument is a simple stone, and actually, if you're driving along the main road, all you can make out is two Chinese characters, and even the backside of the monument is kind of faded and doesn't have text which stands out.